I want to try and give you a feel of the country so that you begin to feel that you're there. I'm quite sure you've already discovered as soon as you're going somewhere, you see it everywhere. Have you noticed that? You notice it in the papers, you see it on posters, and suddenly you're thinking that way. Well, tonight I really want to help you to do that. So first, let's have a look at the land and try and sort of see it to the heart of the world and to the part of what's been called from time immemorial the Fertile Crescent. If I draw the Fertile Crescent, you'll probably see it better. You see it there? That's been called the Fertile Crescent because from time immemorial, human civilization began in this belt, and began there because of these huge rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates at one end and the Nile at the other. And that's where civilization began. The Garden of Eden was somewhere just around here. We can't exactly locate it, but the intriguing thing is that we've now discovered that agriculture, crops, animal husbandry all began in that area there, precisely where the Bible in Genesis 2 says it began. But the civilizations began around this Fertile Crescent, and in fact, the very first town in that Fertile Crescent, the oldest town in the world, is Jericho, which is just about there. And so within that Fertile Crescent, you have the Egyptian civilization, the Babylonian civilization, the Assyrian. And the Bible starts at one end of it, Ur of the Chaldees down here, and Abraham goes all the way around to the Promised Land here. And then I'm afraid they went further than the Lord told them to, and they found themselves down in Egypt and have to come back via Sinai back to where they ought to be. Now that is the Promised Land. And you'll see that it's a narrow piece of land joining three continents. Europe is away up here, Asia is away over there, and Africa is here. And you can see that to get from any of those continents, and even America, which was of course available to the far end of Asia, to get to anywhere in the world, you had to go through this little corridor, because there was the sea on one side and the Arabian desert on the other, which is a barren, dry place. Indeed, down this side of the desert is a row of very hard black basalt hills, which is quite uncrossable for camels, so that you've got a very narrow little corridor there, and a country just about the size of Wales, which sits astride all the main roads of the world. For example, there was a road up from Arabia here called the King's Highway. Do you see it there? King's Highway came up here, crossed over to the coast, and round then off to Europe. There was another road that came right from the Persian Gulf, right up here, right round, crossed here, and went down to Africa that way, called the Way of the Sea. Those were the two biggest roads in the ancient world. And you notice where the crossroads is? It is the crossroads of the world. And at that crossroads there's a little town called Megiddo. It stands on a hill. There's a seat just in there, Tella. It stands on a hill, and in Hebrew, the hill of Megiddo is Armageddon. Armageddon. And that's one of the names that figures not only in the Bible, but in the predictions of the future. This is the crossroads of the world. In fact, in Jerusalem, in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, there's a silver star set into the ground, into the floor, which they will point out to you and say, that is the center of the world. And certainly everything goes through this little country. Now that's its importance. So when God wanted to do something that would affect the whole world, where did he choose? He chooses this little country here, from which anything can spread to the furthermost parts of the earth. And the more we study the shape of this little land, no bigger than Wales, the more we realize that God shaped it with his hands to do precisely what he wanted done in that land. And part of the fascination of going to Israel is to see how the shape of the land and the people and God's purpose all fit together and interlock. It just had to be that way. And one of the greatest helps is to get a really good look at this relief map here. You can come and look at it later. which gives you the feel of the land and gives you the shape of it. It's a very simple shape. And yet the events of the Bible all took place at a particular place because of the shape of the land. And I'll show you more of that later tonight. So I'm afraid it's a bit of a school lesson tonight, but I hope you don't mind that. I want you to get the feel of it. So first of all then, that's right, do come. There's one seat. You just get one seat here. So first of all, you've got the location of the land. We're going to the heart of the world. And in fact, you will feel when you've been that you've been to the center of world affairs. Everywhere else is somewhere else. That's the center. You'll feel many other things. It's the only place I ever go to where I don't feel homesick and my wife doesn't miss me. It's strange that. But she always feels I've gone home when I've gone there. And when I leave there, that's when I feel homesick. You feel that's where it's at. This is the pivot of history. Everything revolves around that. And not only did it do that in the time of Christ and earlier, but also everything now is revolving around that little land. World politics are now Middle East centered yet again, and Israel is back at the heart of world politics. So we're going to this little land the size of Wales, part of the Fertile Crescent, corridor between 3 continents, the crossroads of the world at Megiddo, just north of Jerusalem. And that's its importance. Now, having looked at that, let's now sort of zoom in a bit and try and get the shape of the country. Let's try and get the feel of the country. Try and use a different colour. Upside down. Thank you. I last gave this lecture in Australia. Right. Now, if you can grasp a sort of feel of the whole country and just get the layout of it, you'll very quickly feel at home when you get there and find your way around. Let's just take the simplest features first. The Mediterranean Sea is over here. It's almost a straight coastline. It's got one bump in it where Mount Carmel pushes out to sea, but it's a straight coastline. And then about 30 miles inland, there's a unique feature, a crack in the earth running due north and south, which starts just up here at the foot of Mount Hermon and goes about 2,500 miles due south. Part of it is filled up with water and becomes part of the Red Sea. The right-hand arm of the top of the Red Sea is this crack. Then it goes straight through Ethiopia, where it splits Ethiopia in two. It goes down through Kenya and Uganda, where it's called the Great Rift Valley. And it's the biggest crack in the whole world, the biggest, longest crack. And that has given this corridor effect to the Holy Land. And in fact, that point there, where the Jordan enters the Dead Sea, is the lowest point on the whole surface of the earth. And that's exactly where Jesus came to be baptized. It's interesting, that's how low Jesus came down. It's the only place in the world you can have a pilot's license for flying below sea level. And in fact, they do issue an air pilot's license for flying down below the sea level. What isn't always realized is that the Sea of Galilee is already below sea level, even up at the top of this valley. So that in fact the Sea of Galilee is about 600 feet below, whereas this is about 1,600 feet below. So that that's a huge deep crack. In fact, you can see it, the edge of the crack, on that picture of Bethlehem there. Can you all see that? Perhaps not. Is there another one? No, just that one. But let's see Bethlehem. Bethlehem is there, and that picture is taken looking due east. And can you see how suddenly the land drops away? There's a brown belt, and then you just feel it drops, and you can just see through the mist, I think, the dark hills of the far side of that great crack. And away down in the bottom there, in that crack, is the Dead Sea. So you begin to get the feel of that, the hills and this crack. So we've got the sea one side, and then we've got this very deep crack. Up the middle here, between, we've got basically a line of limestone hills, but they do some funny things. There is a plain festival right down the coast, very flat area. Don't know if we've got any pictures of that area. Don't think we have, no. The Sharon Plain. Sharon means simply flat place. So if you called your baby girl Sharon, I'm afraid it's not a very complimentary name. It means flat. So Sharon, which is a beautiful plain but very flat, is on the coast, and we shall land at Lod Airport near Tel Aviv, right on that flat plain. Then as you cross the country, we'll do a section. We have the sea like this, then we have the plain, then we have low hills called the Shephelah, and these were the hills where the Philistines who lived on the plains used to meet the Jews who lived up in the hills, and most of the battles were in the Shephelah, the low hills and valleys. That's where Samson did most of his exploits, in those low hills. He actually lived in the valley just about here. Then as you move inland, you get a real high hill, and then it drops right down to below sea level before coming back up again, and the Dead Sea is down here. So have you got the section? And so you've got a backbone of hills here. Jerusalem is up in the top of the hills. So when we leave Lod Airport, you'll find that we go along a flat bit, then we begin to go through some lower hills, and in that valley we pass the Samson garage and the Samson coffee bar where he used to meet Delilah. And then you'll notice we begin to climb very steeply up the Judean hills proper until we get to the top, and then we get to Jerusalem. On another day we shall go down from Jerusalem to Jericho. This is the little kind of touch that comes alive. A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Well, you can see from the top of the hill here down to Jericho, which is down here, you really do drop a tremendous amount, over 2,000 feet, no, 3,000 feet. You're dropping down, and you pass a sign that says sea level, and down you go to the bottom where it's hot and sticky, and where you can sit on the waters of the Dead Sea and read a newspaper without sinking. It's a weird place. That's where Jesus was baptized, and this is where he died, up on the top. Then you get the hills of Moab, or Gilead, or Bashan. These are the hills on the other side: Bashan, Gilead, Moab, Ammon. We won't be going there because the present border is there between Jordan and Israel, and we're in Israel. This is the Arab country of Jordan, and this is a barbed wire fence right down the Jordan River and cut off like that. Well, now that's the feel of the land. You've got the plain, the low hills, the high hills, the deep valley, and the distant hills of Moab. Now look at what happens to this ridge as it goes up here. It's simply a ridge of hills most of the way up until it gets to about here. There are certain peaks. There's the Mount of Olives there. There's Mount Ebal and Gerizim here. The mountains of blessing and curse in Joshua, and between them the town of Shechem. And then this whole southern range branches off to the west and heads off to the sea and finishes in a long range and almost a hog's back from about here to here. And that hog's back is Carmel. I think you can just see it on this model. You see that hog's back there? Just like a great pig lying. It's about 12 miles long. And that's Carmel. This is where Elijah... Kiddo's coordination. So there is Carmel. And Carmel just pushes out the coastline to a little bump like that and encloses the harbour at Haifa. Actually, Elijah challenged the prophets of Baal in a large hollow at this end of Carmel, overlooking this plain. And not far from there is a crack in the range, the Megiddo Pass. And the way of the sea from Egypt came up here, through the Megiddo Pass, across the plain, down to the Sea of Galilee, and off to Asia. And the King's Highway came up here. It cut up through that valley, through Megiddo, and off up the coast that way. So here's the crossroads of the world, right there. So that we've got this ridge heading off to the sea. And that leaves a triangular plain. It's a most striking feature. It's a huge triangular flat plain which was swamp until the Jews drained it some decades ago, and it's now beautiful farmland. It's got a big aerodrome in the middle now as well. But it's a huge triangular plain, quite flat, overlooked by this ridge, by Carmel and the mountains of Gilboa, where King Saul fought his last battle and was killed, and overlooked on the north by the hills of Lower Galilee. Nestling on the very edge of those hills is the town of Nazareth, which is almost, again, in a little hollow, overlooking the plain. If you just climb out of the hollow, you can look down on the plain of Israel. There's a photograph at the far end there, taken from the north of Nazareth, looking over the town to the edge of the Galilean hills, which is the very hill where Jesus was, where they tried to throw Jesus over and kill him. And down beyond that hill you can see the big flat plain of Israel, that huge triangular plain. Well, now you can look at these photographs more closely in a short while. That was the battlefield of the Middle East. You can see why. The crossroads of the world is in it. It's a flat plain, and the armies used to gather on the hills facing each other and then swoop down into the plain and fight each other in the bottom. For example, Deborah and Sisera. Do you remember? Deborah gathered the Israelites on Mount Tabor, which is a funny sugar loaf of a mountain, as if somebody tipped out a pile of sugar. Just stands like that at one end of this plain. And she gathered the Israeli troops here, and Sisera came up this valley with his chariots. He couldn't gather on the hill, he kept his chariots in the ground. And the chariots got stuck in the mud here, in the swamp, and the Israelites swept down from that hill and won the battle. And I remember a young Israeli on Mount Tabor describing for me the battle, and he said, you know, our troops were here, and Sisera was down there, and the chariots were stuck away over there, you see, and we swept down here. And he was describing something that was 3,000 years old. And it was as if it had happened just yesterday. And this is one of the things you find. The centuries roll away, and you talk of things as if they happened last Thursday, because the situation is exactly the same. There is the hill of Moreh and Mount Tabor in this triangle. So when you're in the triangle, you see a line of hills to the north, a line of hills to the southwest, and two hills, as it were, guarding this end. Moreh is interesting because it's the little village of Nain, where the widow's son was raised there, and Endor, where there was the spiritus medium there, whom Saul consulted. And these little villages nestle around here. Saul, in fact, was killed in this valley. This valley was also the scene where Gideon and his 300 men got the Midianites who'd come up the king's highway from over here and were coming up and camped in the valley there. And Gideon crept down to the brook, you remember, there, and he got rid of the Midianites on that bit. So it's been the world's battlefield. And when the Egyptians have marched north, or the Assyrians marched south, or the Babylonians came that way, or the Greeks came, or the Romans came, this was invariably the cockpit in which they fought. This is where King Josiah was killed in Jeremiah's day. And during World War II, Winston Churchill believed that Armageddon, the last battle of history, would be fought there as the Germans pressed down from Greece and the Italians came along Africa. He felt the British army would be trapped between them there and Armageddon would take place. So he sent out a team of 15 British army officers to survey that area and produce a plan. You know all about this, Teller, I can see you nodding. To survey that area so that the British army was ready for the Battle of Armageddon, which is interesting. Churchill knew his Bible, and that idea stuck with him. He got the timing wrong, but he got the place right. Then we move further north. And there are two levels of hills in the north. There's a large square of fairly low hills, and then a very high block, which proves almost an impenetrable barrier. Those high hills are the barrier between Israel and Lebanon at the moment. Lower Galilee and a little bit of Upper Galilee is in Israel. Now, Lower Galilee is where Jesus spent his boyhood, and it includes, really, the name Galilee includes the Sea of Galilee. So that block is where he spent his boyhood and most of his ministry, up in the north. Born in Nazareth, a little village overlooking the plain, so that as a boy I can imagine Jesus sort of lying on that hill where they were one day to try and throw him over, with his head in his hands, watching the armies march backwards and forwards through this crossroads, watching the camels, the traders. You may remember, for example, when Joseph was sold by his brothers to the traders. Do you remember that? Well, Joseph was looking after sheep in Dothan, which is here. And here's the main trade route going down to Egypt, you see. So his brothers just took him to that road, sold him, and off he went down to Egypt. It's just all happening. You know, I can hardly talk about this without giving you a Bible study. But every turn of the road gives you something more. And you begin to fit it to a place and see why it happened where it did. So he was born in Nazareth, Cana of Galilee, where he had relatives. 2 of them got married just after his baptism, you remember, and he went to the wedding. That's just a few miles over the hills. And if you continue on that road, you go down to that lovely little lake. It's called Gennesaret, which means the Sea of the Harp. And if you look at the shape of it, can you see a harp? You see, it's about 13 miles long, 8 miles wide. It's a most peaceful little lake. There you see it in a poster there. And that poster, that photograph, Galilee, is taken from very near this road from Nazareth. As you drop down this very sharp from the Galilean hills, there's a big drop down there to the Sea of Galilee. You can see that's taken from the top of the hill looking down, and there's the lovely little lake nestling below. That's where Jesus got most of his disciples. I don't know if you realize, but at least 5 and probably 7 of the disciples were physical relatives of Jesus. Did you realize that? They were related to him. So he had connections with them physically and spiritually. It's intriguing that he chose from his own family quite a lot of his disciples. And there's quite a lot of evidence to show that at least 5 and probably 7 were cousins or second cousins twice removed, but part of his larger family circle. Tiberias was a town the Jews never went to in those days, and Jesus is never mentioned as going to it. It was a pagan town built by Herod, and the Jews kept out of it. Capernaum was the main Jewish center here. From Capernaum you can look back up to the hills of Galilee, and right on the top of a hill up there is Safed. Whether we'll be able to go there or not, I don't know. We'll see how time goes. But from Galilee you look up and you see this mountain, and you can see the city right on the top of it, on the crest. And from far below, just above Galilee, where the low mountain is on which Jesus preached the Sermon on the Mount, he said, "A city set on a hill cannot be hid." And there can be no doubt which one it was, because that city was there in his day, the city of Safed. Let's just look at where we shall go. We'll land at Lod Airport, and then we'll take the bus straight up to Jerusalem, where we are in fact staying inside the old city. We've never done this before, but those who have stayed at this place have said a lot about it. And in fact, we're going to stay in this building here. You see this building there? That is the Christ Church Hostel. Am I right? You're looking doubtful now. Well, there is Christ Church. That's an Anglican church. Very fine man there looking after it. He's the brother-in-law of Dr. Beasley Murray, if that means anything to anyone. But he lives out of Christ Church, and they have this hospice next to it. One of the reasons we're able to do this trip so much more cheaply than the package tours is that we're using the hospice. But in fact the accommodation is good, and I think you'll love being there. And you can see how handy we are. We're looking right over the city in this photograph, from the west wall right up to the eastern end. And well, I'll say more about that city in a moment when we get to it. From Jerusalem we shall have 1 or 2 half-day trips by coach, and 1 whole-day trip. The whole-day trip is quite fascinating. The whole-day trip is, we will leave Jerusalem, head south past Bethlehem, which is only half an hour's walk from Jerusalem. It's only 4 miles. And we go south through Hebron, where we see the graves of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and head off towards Beersheba, as we call it, Beersheba as they call it, out on the level plain. It's just south of the hills of Judea. We don't go right into Beersheba, let's get it right. There's not much to see there anyway. We cut off before we get there and head off around the bottom of the Judean hills to Masada, the place where the Jews had their last stand in 135 AD. It's an incredible place. There is a rock, a diamond-shaped rock, hundreds of feet high, with a sheer drop on every side. And on the top of there, Herod built his palace, and the remaining Jews were trapped by the Roman army and besieged for 3 years, at the end of which they all committed suicide except one mother and her girl who hid, and they survived to tell the incredible tale. So we'll go to Masada. Then we'll head north along the Dead Sea, and we shall look across to the site of Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah lie under there somewhere. All that's been found of Sodom is a graveyard. The rest is lying under the Dead Sea. For the bottom end of the Dead Sea erupted and sank, and the water went over the site of the towns. We shall come north to a place where there is a freshwater spring on the edge of the Dead Sea, which is terribly salt. And that's the place, the area where David hid from his son Absalom. He hid in the caves all around En Gedi. And it was in that area that most of the Psalms were written. And when you see the area, you'll get the feel of a hunted man, feeling that everybody was against him. And you'll understand many of the Psalms when you've seen En Gedi. We shall come north and visit Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, a Jewish monastery in the days of Christ. And you know what the Dead Sea Scrolls meant. A complete copy of the prophet Isaiah, 1,000 years older than any other copy we'd ever had. Can you imagine taking back your knowledge of a Bible book 1,000 years and seeing if it had changed? And you know, the amazing thing is that even though this was 1,000 years earlier than the earliest copy we had, nevertheless very few alterations needed to be made in the Revised Standard Version, which was just being translated when those scrolls were discovered. I hope you find all this fascinating, because I'm sort of getting you started already, but every corner of the road, you have to jump centuries. In fact, you'll be punch drunk after a bit, and you'll be punch drunk after tonight, I warn you. But the advantage of going through it before is that you get the feel. From Qumran, we'll perhaps visit the Dead Sea and maybe have a little swim, in quotes, on top of the water, and then we'll visit Jericho and see the excavations of Joshua's wall and even older cities there, and then we'll come back up to Jerusalem past Bethany. Bethany is just on the other side of the Mount of Olives to Jerusalem. You've got to go up and over all round to get to Bethany, where Jesus spent most of the last nights of his life in that last week, until the last night when he spent it in Gethsemane. Half-day trips, we may go down to Emmaus, which is down there. We'll certainly visit Bethlehem and the shepherd's fields. When we leave Jerusalem, this is the way we'll take. We'll go north, past Bethel, where Jacob dreamt, Shiloh, which was the first holy place in Israel, long before Jerusalem became the place of God. Then we shall cut through to Shechem, where we'll see Jacob's well, the very well, absolutely the very well, where the woman of Samaria talked to Jesus, and the well which Jacob dug. There's only one well, there only has been one well there, and it's still running the most beautiful fresh water. We shall pass between the two mountains two huge peaks against the skyline, which always stand as a reminder to all the people living in this land that God will bless those who are obedient and curse those who are disobedient. Gerizim is the mount of blessing, Ebal is the mount of curse. And all the Israelites had to gather between and hear the blessings of God shouted from one mountain and the curses shouted from the other after they got into the land. And the acoustics between those two mountains, which have a kind of hollow face facing each other. If you can imagine two big round mountains with a hollowed out face facing each other, it's a natural amphitheatre. And you can shout from one mountain to the other. And acoustically, you can just see it all happening. There they stand. Shechem now lies between the two. On Mount Gerizim are the last remaining Samaritans. There are now about 350 of them. They nearly died out before Second World War, but they've just had a few more babies and they're climbing up again. They got down to 200. The Samaritans, as you probably know, are a mixed race, a kind of half-caste. They're a bit like the colours of South Africa. And how it happened was this: when the Jews were taken away to exile into Babylon, a few managed to stay, but they were rather short of girls to fall in love with, so they fell in love with girls outside the people of God. And this produced a half-caste, a Samaritan, neither Jew nor Gentile, but a mixture. When the true Jews came back from exile, the Samaritans said, can we join in with you again? And the true Jews said, nothing doing. And from that day onwards, there was a gulf between the Jews and the Samaritans, which has never been bridged. And so we may be able to visit the Samaritans. They live on Gerizim. I remember one time I went, after they'd showed us their marvellous copy of the first 5 books of the Bible, which is all the Bible they have: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And they've got one of the, in fact, probably the oldest copy of that in the world. The British Museum offered them £5 million for it, and they're desperately poor, but they wouldn't take it. And after they showed us this, this man put out his hand towards me and said, what was it? Remember that a Samaritan gave Jesus a drink of water. And I said, she didn't. He asked for one, but he never got it. He said, I don't believe that. So I took out the New Testament and I showed him. And he said, oh, I didn't know that. He'd always thought she gave him a drink of water, and that therefore I, as a Christian, should repay him for her drink of water to our Lord. So then he said, well, remember the Good Samaritan. And I had no answer to that. So there it was. We'll then go further north to ancient Samaria, where we'll visit the ruins of Ahab's palace and the ivory palace of Omri. A marvellous excavation work has been done there. We'll go on through Dothan, where Joseph had all his dreams, and not his many-coloured coat, but his short-sleeved coat. That's terribly important. The coat of many colours is a total myth. Got the translation wrong. If a man had many sons, he gave, not short-sleeved, a long-sleeved coat. He gave every son a short-sleeved coat and one son a long-sleeved coat. And the long-sleeved one was the foreman. He didn't work, so he didn't need to roll up his sleeves. The others all worked, and the long-sleeved coat was the one in charge of the others. Now can you imagine why they hated Joseph? Because he wasn't even the oldest. And his father gave him the long sleeves, and he didn't have to work, and he just bossed the others. On to Jezreel, and I'm sure you know a bit about Jezebel. And then we'll cut down past the valley where Gideon tackled the Midianites and where Saul was killed, to Beth Shan, where we'll see the ruins of the biblical Beth Shan, and you can see the gateway on which they stuck King Saul's head after he was killed. Then we'll come north to Tiberias, which is our second base. And there we're staying in the Scottish hospice. Is there a picture of Tiberias anywhere? No. We're right on the lakeside in the most gorgeous place with Bougainvillea in the... By the way, you're going at a marvellous time. You're going when the flowers will be out in Galilee. and you're going while it's still green. So you're going at a jolly good time. It will not be hot, by the way. It'll be pleasantly warm. It'll be like a spring day here. Maybe cool in the evenings. You may need cardigans. So it won't be unpleasantly hot. In fact, one year at the time we're going, they had snow in Jerusalem. That was a bit of a freak. They'd had it one year when we went out later in August. But it should be nice spring weather. The rain should have just stopped. And so the Galilee will still be very green, as it is in that photograph over there. If you go from May onwards, it's brown and dry. But we shall see Galilee, and you'll see whole fields of flowers around. Galilee will be beautiful at that time of the year. We'll base ourselves at Tiberias. We've only got 3 days there, or 2 and a bit. So one of those days, probably the first day after we arrive, I hope you don't mind this, but I think this will be the right thing to do, while we've still got the bus, we'll do a very big round trip in the north. I don't know which way round we'll do it. We'll probably do it this way. We'll probably go by Mount Tabor, past Endor, Nain, across to Megiddo, where we'll look at Solomon's stables and the fortifications and view the future battlefield. We'll cut through the pass. We'll go to Caesarea, known to you as Caesarea. We'll go to Caesarea and we'll try and have a swim in the harbour. That is the most perfect place in the entire world to swim. Many people said it was the best thing that happened on that trip last time. You can still see the old Roman pillars of the pier. It's the most beautiful harbour with a sandy bottom and beautiful turquoise sea and warm. It's just absolutely perfect. We'll then cut north, round by Carmel, through the modern town of Haifa, where there's nothing biblical. It's a modern port, a huge port, the centre of the Baha'i religion, a very strange amalgam of faiths, a very simple, almost naive faith. It's believe in God and do your best. I think that sums up Baha'i. And there's a huge golden dome temple of the Baha'i faith built by Hollywood film stars right in the middle of Haifa. Round to Acre, the old Arab fishing town for the bay. That's where I stayed in a house on the city wall and went fishing at 5 o'clock in the morning for my breakfast when I was there last September. An Arab and a Crusader town, not a biblical town, but fascinating to see a real Arab town, and an old biblical style inn with rooms all around a courtyard, and to see something of the Crusaders. Then we'll head back to Nazareth, where we hope to visit Joyce Peart and visit the hospital and see a bit of Nazareth. Nazareth, in a sense, is a little disappointing to some people. It's an Arab town, essentially, and they expect to see a very picturesque little country village, and you will bear out that it's not. It's a noisy Arab town, but you can become very fond of it. It's dominated, alas, by a sort of wedding cake building of monstrous proportions in modern architecture, built by the Roman Catholics, and the largest Catholic church in Europe. Wasn't that what it said in that film today? In the Middle East, sorry, in the Middle East, that's right. Largest Catholic church in the Middle East. It's a monstrosity. But we'll get the feel of the hills of Jerusalem, and you'll see that lovely work in the hospital. We'll probably go and see your cupboards done, so you must tell us which ward it was you built them in. Then we'll head off through Cana and back to Tiberias. For most of the rest of the time in Galilee, we'll wander around the Sea of Galilee. We'll get a boat across. If it's in the afternoon, you might get a pretty rough crossing, because that's when these sudden storms come. As the hot air rises from the lake and the cold air rushes down the hills and ravines, it churns it up and makes it very dangerous. We'll go around the lake to Capernaum. If we can manage it, we might head further up the valley to Caesarea Philippi, which is well worth seeing if we can fit it in. I'm not going to make any promises about that. It's way up at the head of the valley of the creek. Here's Galilee down at the bottom. You've got to go right up this valley here. Caesarea Philippi is here at the foot of Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon you can see in the distance with a snow-capped peak all year round. And it's from the melting of those snows that the Jordan River starts. The Jordan is a river that starts nowhere and finishes nowhere. It comes out from the foot of a cliff, just like that, a solid cliff, and there's a river just coming out of it. In fact, it's coming from an underground crack. And the melted snow has gone down inside Mount Hermon. It's come out of this underground crack. And you look at it, it's just as if it was that wall and this strip of blue floor covering coming straight from it. And then it goes to the Dead Sea and finishes. The heat of the Dead Sea evaporates it sufficiently. In fact, the Dead Sea is going down rapidly. So you've got a long haul over a sticky, salty beach to get to the water now from the bathing cubicles. It would be about, 200 yards, 300 yards? It's quite a long walk now. And it was, the bathing things were built on the beach side. So it's a weird and wonderful land. In fact, you've got within this land every type of country you could imagine. You've got snow-capped mountains, you've got sandy desert, you've got deep ravines, you've got beautiful hills, you've got gentle valleys, you've got sharp gorges, you've got beautiful plains, you've got almost every kind of the world's geography within a country the size of Wales. And in a sense, this is a mini world. It's almost as if God wanted every type of world here, so that what happened here could, as it were, fit every other part of the world. Again, one sees an amazing purpose of God in putting so much within such a tiny area. And the variety as you drive through it is incredible. Each part has a different feel to it. Some parts are forested and heavily wooded and beautifully green, and other parts there isn't a blade of grass. Look at that picture of the Mount of Temptation. Now that is here. It's on the edge. It's just there. It's on the edge of the Judean hills, and it's above Jericho. And there never is a blade of grass on it. That's the wilderness, and the reason is very simple. There are only two winds in Israel. One comes from the west and one comes from the east. Meteorology is relatively simple. When it comes from the west, it brings clouds and rain. That's why Elijah sent his servant up to the top of Carmel to see if there were any clouds forming above the Mediterranean. And he said, I can see a cloud no bigger than a man's hand. You can still watch this and see the clouds beginning to form. You know there's rain coming. The wind is from the west. But you know that, let's go back to our section now. You remember this section that we originally drew? Well, now, here's the cloud forming. The rain is going to drop on the hills, right? So it will be green up to the top. But as soon as the cloud passes that hill, because the land is dropping away, there's no raindrops. And so from the top to the bottom there, it is absolutely barren. That's what is meant by the wilderness in the Bible. It's not a desert miles and miles away. It's on the very edge of Jerusalem. You can see it in the Bethlehem picture there. There's a little bit of green in Bethlehem itself. Can you see some green trees? But just a mile beyond that, you see there isn't a blade of green grass. It just goes absolutely barren. And then when the cloud reaches the other side, there's a bit of green again, because the rain drops a second time, so that there's balsam growing in Gilead. Is there no balm in Gilead? So there are trees over there. So you've got a green side up here, then a barren side down, then a green side up again. You got the picture? And so you get a green strip this side, very green, and Galilee is quite green in the wet season. Then you've got this very barren strip down here, the wilderness, where John the Baptist was, where Jesus was for his temptation. Then you've got the green over the other side in Gilead, and where they used to have the bulls of Bashan, for example, up to their knees in grass. Well, now the next thing we'll look at is Jerusalem itself. Let's come back to the city where we're going to be for 7 out of the 10 days. I'm going to give you a copy of each of these 3 drawings to take home. We've got them all duplicated for you so that you've got them, and you see we've been zooming in from the whole Fertile Crescent down to the Holy Land. Now we're going to zoom in on an even more interesting little area, Jerusalem. This is the only place in the world that could be the city of God. because of its geography. There could be nowhere else like it in the world. And I want you to get the feel of Jerusalem. Now, the first thing to realize is that Jerusalem is surrounded by hills. If I just draw a circle, the great horseshoe, there's just one gap in that circle of hills, and that's here, where the brook Kidron runs away to the Dead Sea. So if you can imagine a horseshoe of hills. Now, can you imagine also that that horseshoe of hills is tipped slightly so that it's higher here than here? You're beginning to get the idea? Slope the opposite way to this deck here, actually. Slope the other way. So that you've got a horseshoe of hills. Now, you know that if you lift up a horse's foot, next time you see a horse, go and lift up its foot. And you'll see that there's a kind of tongue in the middle of the horse's hoof. Have you seen that? There's a tongue in the middle of a horse's hoof. Now that tongue, in this case, is a ridge of hills running from there to there. And it's higher here and lower here. It goes all the way down. I'll show you it in a moment. Now that hill is the hill of God. And the whole of it is lower than the horseshoe. So that Jerusalem is unique. It's on the top of the Judean hills, yet it's not quite the top. It's below the circle of the top. So that in fact you never see Jerusalem until you get to it. You've got to go up to the very top and then down to Jerusalem. And you drop into it from the horseshoe, whichever way you approach. The highest part of the horseshoe here is called Mount Scopus. And if you know what the word Scopus means, it means view. Telescopus, microscopus. Scopus means view. And that's the point where you can stand and understand the psalm which says, "Beautiful is Mount Zion from the north." You see, the hills and the mountains girding it around. And from that point, it's just as if your two arms are going around Jerusalem in the hills. You got it? And it's a very beautiful sight. And so Jerusalem seems to nestle in the hollow of God's hand. Just like that. Right in the middle. There it is. As if the hills are holding it. I'll lift up mine eyes to the hills. So you get this feel of the hills. So even when you're worshipping God and you've climbed right up to the top, as it were, to the temple, you never forget earth. That's the first thing. Earth is still around you, so that God doesn't want us to escape from earth, and He doesn't want us to get away from earth. He wants us to get near to heaven, but not to leave earth behind. Most of the pagan high places were on the tops of mountains so that they could leave earth and escape from it, but not God's temple. You're still in earth and surrounded by it. You can still look up to the hills when you're at the temple area. I wonder if you can see this picture here. This is taken from the Mount of Olives. Now, in fact, the skyline is the other side of the horseshoe running right round, you see? And here is the ridge in the middle on which the temple stood, and this is the Mosque of Omar, the Dome of the Rock, which is on the site of the ancient Jewish temple. And you can see it's below the horseshoe. Can you see that? And it's nestling there beautifully. It's the most perfect spot. There's something even more interesting than that. There is the Dome of the Rock. Now, it is a beautiful octagonal building. It's got 8 sides like that. And it sits there on a flat stone platform 14 acres in size. That's pretty big. You could put 13 English cathedrals in it. Now, here's the interesting thing. If you go round the Dome of the Rock, is there a picture of it anywhere there? Oh yes, in Jerusalem. There it is. Now, you can see there, that's the other side of the horseshoe with the Mount of Olives there. But you can see the horseshoe is higher. Here's the ridge we've been talking about, and halfway along it is the temple. Now, you see the 8-sided building there. If you went round that 8-sided temple and stood with your back, put your shoulders against each wall and look, you'll see an astonishing thing. You look there and you see the Mount of Olives. You look there and you'll see Mount Scopus. And each of these faces, as you look out, every single one hits the top of a mountain.
at 45 degrees exactly. It's mathematical. Now, they're not all at the same distance. They may be a bit further away on the horseshoe. It's a little irregular. But the mathematical orientation of that site is exactly 45 degrees. And one of the things that somebody has done, which has helped us, two of the things which people have done, first, on each of these, somebody's planted a little clump of trees. I don't know who did it, but it's really marked out the top of the peak. And then, outside the Dome of the Rock, standing like this, various places, are the weirdest things, just a row of arches, freestanding, not connected to anything. Just a row of arches like that. And it's just a wall with arches in it. And if you stand with your back to the mosque and look through the arch, you'll see the mountain framed in the arch. And there's an example of one. See? There's one of the arches. And that's all there is to it. There are about 5 of those arches. You look through the middle arch, and there are the trees on Mount of Olives. You see, straight ahead. And therefore, that place is perfectly orientated to Earth. You see, it perfectly fits Earth. Mathematically. The next thing is that at the northern equinox, the sun rises exactly over the Mount of Olives when you're standing here. And it comes across this line directly over the temple, and it sets directly over this hilltop here. It's exactly on the line of the sun at the equinox. And therefore, the temple is perfectly related to heaven as well as to earth. See? It's absolutely spot on mathematically to unite heaven and earth and to worship the God of heaven and earth. And you know, that has only been discovered comparatively recently in the last few years. Isn't it incredible? The people who did that knew that they were framing the mountaintops, but it's only in the last few years that it's been discovered by a Jewish architect that is the perfect place for the worship of the God of heaven and earth. Now, this is part of the fascination. And when you get to Jerusalem and gaze, especially from the Mount of Olives, at this ridge running down the middle at the horseshoe and the temple area on it, you just feel, well, what's right about it? You know, it just feels so right. It feels so in proportion. It feels so just the perfect spot for a temple. Well, that's what it is. Now, we shall be staying just inside here, the west gate. All the gates of Jerusalem are open except one, and that's the Golden Gate, which is on the east side of the temple, on that line of the sun. I've got it slightly off there. On that line, and that's the gate that Jesus rode into. This was the Messiah's gate. It has been bricked up for centuries now, and Ezekiel predicted that it would be bricked up until the Messiah came. And there it stands, the only gate that has never been opened. It was bricked up almost immediately after it was built. That gate, in its present form, was built by Solomon the Magnificent, and for some reason he bricked it up as soon as he built it. It's an extraordinary thing, but it's kept for the Messiah. But we're in the opposite gate, the Jaffa Gate, which is just in here. That's the gate through there, between the two towers. It's called a gate. There isn't an actual gate on that side. They've driven a road in. It's one of the few roads that you can get in with a car, though you can't get in very far. And immediately inside the gate here is Herod's citadel. It's called David's Tower. That's what they call it now. But in fact, it is Herod's citadel. That's where Herod lived when Jesus was sent to Herod by Pontius Pilate. Somewhere inside there, Jesus stood before Herod and had nothing to say to him. We shall go to a Salle Lumiere inside there, most magnificent 3-hour pageant of history done with lights and music, using all the parts of the towers of that. That's a unique experience. Right? We really must do that. I keep referring to Ruth to confirm what I'm saying. I'm hoping what I'm saying is true, you see. That means we are right within the old city, and if we just walk down that street there, we should be into the Arab souk, the old covered bazaar, which really is most colourful and smelly. We could, in fact, go pretty well straight down there to the Wailing Wall, which you can just see a bit of it there. Here it is, just here, this bit of the wall there, which is the only bit of the original temple, or the Herod's temple of our Lord's day, that is still visible, still standing. Jesus predicted the whole temple would fall, and it did, but this was part of the platform on which it stood, and that's still there. Now, can you see that, in fact, the horseshoe is here, but there are 3 valleys running in like fingers. They all drain into one, the Kidron Valley, which goes down to the Dead Sea. There's this beautiful Kidron Valley here between the temple and the Mount of Olives. It's down in the bottom there that you've got the Garden of Gethsemane. We maybe will catch the bus out to Bethany and then walk back up on the very road that our Lord came on Palm Sunday, and walk up to the Mount of Olives and then down to Gethsemane, up to the Golden Gate, or we'll have to get in through Stephen's Gate where Stephen was stoned, and get into the temple. That is the most marvellous walk. Usually when we've done it, when we've got to the Mount of Olives at the top, we've suggested that we walk in total silence from there to the bottom. And just to walk in silence down that hill and see the temple above you, see Gethsemane below you, that's quite an experience. That's where we stayed last time, actually, the Panorama Hotel, just off the picture to the right. Now, the city of David, Jerusalem of the Old Testament, is just this little tongue of land here. You can't really see much of it today. There are very few buildings on it. It's that little tongue there. Do you see a little tongue there going down from the temple area? This is the Kidron Valley here, and you can just see the tongue of that land down there. It's a very tiny little area, and this is the shock you get. Jerusalem was a very tiny city, and the city was about the same size as the temple. It was a huge thing, almost out of all proportion to the city. And to go from the city of David to the temple, you had to climb up this very steep hill. Let us go up to the house of the Lord, and you'll find yourself going up that road. The water supply was the problem, because the only water spring was here at Gihon, just outside the wall. There's the old Jebusite wall. Kathleen Kenyon has dug up a bit of that just there, and that's right back to before David got it. Just outside is the spring Gihon. David got into the city because there was an underground staircase from that spring up to the wall there. And if you remember, he took the city by getting in through the spring and climbing up the conduit. But in fact, it was Hezekiah who years later said, we've got to get that water inside the city. So they dug a tunnel 1,600 feet long into the city, into a pool, which is the pool of Siloam or Silwan. And that tunnel is about 7 feet high and about that wide, and it's about that full of water. And if you bring a torch, you can come through it with us. That is an experience. It's not for the claustrophobic. It really isn't, because you go through it. If you imagine you're going through, you're having to bend at times, and you're up to here in water, and the rock is pressing you either side. So if you are nervous at all, don't do it. And you think, gosh, if the water rose 2 feet, we've had it. And you wade through, and all kinds of things are in the bottom, so bring some plimsoll shoes. But the funniest thing about that is when you come out in the pool of Siloam, we don't tell anybody this, but I'm going to tell you because it's really unfair. You come out wading like this, but a yard from the exit, the pool goes about 12 feet deep. And time again, we had to come in. Well, it wasn't so bad. Disappearing totally. The last time we went through, Jack May was leading. If you can imagine Jack May, he was in swimming trunks and he had this torch, and the water was up to his chest at one point. And the naughty man, he did this, and he went down, and he bent his legs until he disappeared beneath the water, and all we could see was an arm with a torch going on like this. And we just had hilarious fun. But it's incredible, really. You know, the Bible said that Hezekiah dug this tunnel from Gihon through to Siloam. And for centuries, nobody knew where it was. And then one day, in the late 19th century, 1880 something or other, a boy in Jerusalem, an Arab boy, was playing and he fell in a hole and disappeared. And they sort of got torches and they got a rope and they went down. And they went down and down and down, and they found him in this tunnel. And in fact, they shone the torch around, and there on the wall was inscribed, almost in the biblical language, King Hezekiah finished this tunnel on such and such a date. They've dug out that inscription, it's now in the museum. But they'd found the Hezekiah's tunnel. It's in things like this, you know, somebody who doesn't believe the Bible, they ought to just visit Israel. At every turn in the road, it just comes alive and becomes very ordinary. Can I add something there? Some of you are going to get a shock. And the shock will be that hitherto you've thought of the Bible stories as up there, in a kind of stained glass window, a heavenly halo kind of atmosphere. And suddenly the whole thing will come down to earth with a bump for you. Some people are very disappointed, in the sense that, it's dirty and it's smelly and it's real. Now, you soon get over that initial feeling. But some people have it, not everybody by a long way. But in fact, if you've tended to be a little sort of airy-fairy about Bible stories, then you'll get a little bit of a shock. But when you come back, you will not be able to tell a Bible story in the same way again. Our Sunday school superintendent at Gold Hill used to say, I can pick out every Sunday school teacher you've taken to Israel. Not because they mention it, but because they now tell a Bible story in the same tone of voice as they talk about Saturday's football match. Now that was intriguing. And he said they tell it with a reality that the other teachers don't tell it. Now this is going to make the Bible a very real book for you. It'll bring it down to earth with a bump, but it'll make it jolly real. So if you've got sort of fantasies about the Bible, they will be destroyed. But when you go through Hezekiah's tunnel, you have fun. You think of the tunnelers having fun, teasing each other. It's also real. And suddenly a 3,000-year-old tunnel is something that's just been dug. And you're living in it. So the city of David was this town. The temple area is the huge platform above it, 14 acres. At the northern end is the Castle Antonio. One of our most moving sights will be to go in the dungeons there, or not the dungeons, sort of basement underneath, to the very pavement on which our Lord stood before Pilate. It is there. You can see the marks of the horses' hooves and the chariot wheels from the Roman days. You know this is exactly where Jesus stood. And a nun there, Sister Agnes, if we can get hold of her, she is incredible. She's just full of the Spirit of the Lord. And she must tell the story hundreds of times. But when she tells the story of our Lord's trial, as you stand on that pavement, you just never forget that. Pilate's house is next door to the Castle Antonio. There is a big division of opinion among scholars and archaeologists and everybody else, but mainly among church authorities, as to where Jesus was crucified. And here is one of the problems that we have when you don't know the exact place, and I want to mention now the problem. The official place is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which frankly will make you sick. Or it did me. I just had to leave it and go outside into the fresh air. I just felt sick. It's run by 5 different ancient denominations, the Coptics, the Armenians, Catholics and so on. It's just full of the most gaudy, glittery, cheap sort of stuff. Well, no, I think it's pretty expensive. It's solid gold, most of it. But it just looks cheap. It looks like a fairground. And it just looks nothing. They've put this gigantic sepulchre above the place. And frankly, it's not terribly helpful. Now, we mustn't therefore be prejudiced against that being the site of the crucifixion, because it's pretty horrible to us. I think you will be put off by that. That and the church at Bethlehem are not terribly helpful places to visit. We probably will, but in fact last time we didn't even bother with the Church of Bethlehem. We wanted to see the Shepherd's Fields and the surrounding countryside. We don't make this a shrine tour, by the way. Unfortunately, some people just want to go to shrines. And I said to a Roman Catholic lady, I thought this was rather sad. I said, we love to visit the country and feel the hills and get back into it. And I said, I think it's a pity they built a church on so many of the sites. And she said, oh, but you couldn't pray if there wasn't a church. And this poor dear lady, you see, was so tied to an altar that she had to have that to pray there. And yet we found the opposite. We found we could pray much better getting out into the hills and looking at the Sea of Galilee and so on. So it's a different approach. The Holy Sepulchre is claimed to be the site of our Lord's death and resurrection. And from the Castle Antonia there is a very roundabout route called the Via Dolorosa, the Way of Tears, which is said to be the road of the cross. And it's an intriguing thing to do, to walk that road and just think of the Lord going through the narrow streets. Terribly narrow, twisting route. But it was towards the end of the 19th century that something happened. General Gordon, who was the man killed in Khartoum when the British Army failed to get there in time, you remember, a few years before was staying in Jerusalem. And he was staying in a house here, a house owned by some missionaries by the name of Spafford. And your husband, Muriel, was telling me about all this week. He's been to the house, I think. And he was reading his Bible, and he looked across. Now, this range, this sort of backbone of hills, is Mount Moriah of the Bible. And in fact, this is the very spot where Abraham sacrificed Isaac. Long before the temple was ever put there. That was where Abraham nearly killed Isaac. And you can see the rock inside the dome of the rock. There's just the bare top of the rock. It's a lower peak, not as high as this one. Mount Moriah has two peaks, one here, where the temple was, and one here. But during the days of the Maccabees, an artificial cut was made right through. It was just cut through. And the reason was for defense purposes, so that the enemy couldn't attack Jerusalem from that top hill coming down. And so they cut a gap through that. And the gap is maybe, at points, it's about 40 feet deep. It was a kind of moat right through. So they separated that bit from this bit. Now this bit is left standing with a kind of round top like that, and in fact is the exact sort of shape of a human cranium. And the Hebrew word for cranium or skull is Golgotha. Now that doesn't mean the face of a skull, it means the cranium, it means the top part, that part. And that's exactly the shape of this top bit. It is the shape of a cranium. But as General Gordon read his Bible that day and looked across, he saw the face of a skull in the bit that had been cut by the Maccabees. Now look at that picture, Calvary. That's taken from sideways, so you can't see the face too clearly, but I think you can just make out the two eye sockets and the broken nose. And you just can't see the slit from the mouth too clearly. But can you see vaguely the face of a skull? Now, the cranium is the top of that. The face, in fact, has been weathering since the Maccabees cut that slit through, and that's the northern face. That is that face there. And as he looked at that, he thought, that surely is the place of the skull, the cranium. And he said, if it is, then nearby there must be A, a garden, and B, a rich man's tomb. And so at the foot of that face, and just to the left, he began to make inquiries. And he found that there were things under there, and he excavated the whole thing. When they got down, they found three things. They found first a garden from the 1st century AD. They found second, one tomb beautifully carved out of the rock. A tomb which was not only obviously a rich man's tomb, but had every detail in it to fit the biblical story. And one of the most telling details was this. Peter and John, you remember, they stooped down and they looked into the tomb and they saw the body had gone. Now, how can you look into a dark cave and see the body has gone? This tomb, of many tombs in the Middle East, this has a unique feature, and that is it has a little slit window right through the rock, which lets light straight in onto the main place where the body lay. Now, there were 3, as it were, beds inside this cave when they discovered it. One was complete, the other 2 were unfinished. One was for a large person, one was small, and one was medium, father, mother, and child. It was a family tomb. The only one that was completed was the father part. And furthermore, one end of it had been hacked out with a pickaxe to make it longer in a hurry, whereas the rest of the stone was quite neatly shaped, so that it looked as if it had been used quickly for somebody longer or taller than the person it had been done for. Now, all this was very exciting. They found a garden, they found a tomb that fitted perfectly, and they found something more. They found the foundations of a 3rd century Christian church. And they found the foundations of a baptistry. And the baptistry was so constructed that it faced the door of the open tomb, so that when people had been baptized, they were facing the open door of the tomb. And the wall of the tomb facing the church had been actually cut out. It's now being built up again with blocks cemented in to show you how it was originally. But in other words, that cave tomb had been included within a place of worship. Now, all that was pretty startling. And there's one final thing. Underneath the Damascus gate here, they have now discovered remains of a Herodian gate built before the time of Christ. And this northern wall of the present city, built by Suleiman the Magnificent, not till about the 14th century, this northern wall was said to be a later wall built after the time of Christ, and that in the time of Christ the wall was here, down here. But now, having discovered a Herodian gate underneath the Damascus gate, we know that the wall in Jesus' day was in fact on that line, which puts the Holy Sepulchre inside the city wall. Now, there's one other thing, and this is more of a spiritual kind. A father offered his only son here. Abraham offered Isaac here. And he was told to look around, and he saw a ram with its head caught in thorns. And he sacrificed that instead. And God said, call the place Jehovah Jireh, the Lord will provide a sacrifice. A lamb with its head in thorns. That place of the skull is the same mountain. It's the other end of Mount Moriah. And in the mount of the Lord it shall be provided a sacrifice, a lamb with a crown of thorns on its head. So that spiritually too, this would seem far more the place than this. We cannot be conclusive, but I'm intrigued to know that Jewish archaeologists are now coming round to that place, as distinct from this. And an article in the Weekly Telegraph magazine on this by a Jewish archaeologist said that the Jews, the Israeli archaeologists, are now favouring this, which I find very intriguing. Now, whether it is the right place or not, it is the right atmosphere, and we shall be there Sunday morning for our worship in the garden tomb. And to worship facing that tomb on a Sunday morning is just something you can never forget. So that's only a little walk round the city wall, and you can walk to it any time you like. It's a lovely place to go and have a quiet time, and it's open most of the time. So that's the feel of Jerusalem. Does that give you the feel? There's Akeldama down in the valley of hell. That's where Judas hanged himself. Field of blood. Anything else on here I haven't mentioned? Stephen's Gate. Just outside that gate, Paul watched Stephen stoned. And then Paul set off through the Damascus gate to go and get those Christians up there and met the risen Christ. Emmaus is away off that way, Samaria is off that way, We're living right in the city. I've said nothing about New Jerusalem. There are many interesting things there. The Dead Sea Scrolls are there, and we can go and see them. And the Jerusalem University and the Houses of Parliament. But all that is non-biblical. That's part of today. Right, well, that's Jerusalem. And I think I've said enough on the geography tonight. The next time we get together, I'm going to talk about the history. Because history and geography go together here. God gave His word in time and in space, but not in all time and not in all space. He chose a particular part of space and a particular period of time. He chose a holy land and a holy period in which He spoke, and everything before and since relates to that. So the whole world focuses in on this place. And it was here that our redemption was wrought, and it was here that our hope began. And it is to this place that the Lord Himself will return. So everybody in the church is going to have a trip to the Holy Land sooner or later. But it's lovely to go sooner. Well, now, that's, I hope, given you a real feel of the place. Look, there's the garden too, man. I hadn't realised I got one. Somewhere just here is the base of the baptistry. There's a bit of the remains of the rolling stone. There's a chunk of it there. A huge stone which rolled along in that channel there and must have weighed 3/4 of a ton. No wonder the women were a bit worried about moving. That is the window that lets in light right into the stone bed for the corpse beyond. There's the door which leads into an antechamber and then looks through to where the bodies were. That's the bit that they dug out when they built a church here. And when they excavated, the rubbish was up to here, and there was no sound of this. When they dug it out, they found this shape. Can you see that shape? That's the roof of the church which was built against it. You see? So that here is a very remarkable confirmation. If you ask how did they come to build the church of the Holy Sepulchre where they did, the answer is that when the Emperor Constantine, in about the year 310, became a Christian, the first emperor to do so, one of the things he did was to take his aged mother, Helena, to visit the Holy Land. Being the emperor, he could go there, and he could afford it, so off he went, one of the first pilgrims to go. And when he got there, they could not find any trace of the cross and resurrection. And so Helena is said to have prayed and to have received in a revelation that was the place. Now that's all there is to go. She had no evidence. It was a revelation, she said, that was the place. Well, I leave that with you. The only confirming evidence that it might be is this. We know that the place she said it was had on it a temple of Venus. And we know that the Emperor Hadrian, in about the year, what are his dates? About 120? Pardon?
Hadrian's Wall was 122.
Right, gosh, I was near to right, about 120. Right, well, he built the Hadrian's Wall 122 in my part of England, but he also went to Jerusalem quite deliberately to desecrate it, though it had already been destroyed in AD 70, and he deliberately built a pagan temple to Jupiter on the side of the temple, to Venus, to Mercury, and all the other gods. And therefore, where Hadrian built a pagan temple, there was usually something Christian or Jewish underneath. And Helena took his temple of Venus and said he built Venus temple on top of the sacred side of the tomb. That's how it arose. It certainly was a burial ground at one stage. But I can't be dogmatic. I just know that everything in me cries out for this place. And certainly the atmosphere and the whole approach is absolutely right. But the Jewish archaeologists come around to that. This picture, Kidron Valley, Golden Gate is just here. There are those framed archways. Do you see them? And there are some more. The Mosque of Al-Aqsa was the headquarters of the Crusader Knights, who I'm afraid blotted our British copybook badly by trying to force the Holy Land back into Christian hands. They killed off all the Jews in Jerusalem, I'm afraid. But it was also in that building that the St. John's Ambulance started. which is intriguing. But it's now an Arab mosque. There's the King David Hotel and the YMCA Tower just beyond. But you can see this tunnel. This is Mount Moriah, this tunnel. That's the other side of the horseshoe. I've spoken about that. Gethsemane, the garden, is just down in the bottom there. This is from the Mount of Olives, Mount of Temptation. Bethlehem, you're looking out to the shepherd's fields, which are on the left, the greenish bit at the top of the picture, and then you've got that sharp drop in the wilderness, barren, right down to the Dead Sea. What have we got around the corner? Bethany, well, that's just over the top of the Mount of Olives, and you can see why it's called the Mount of Olives. You can see the olive trees. Galilee, Calvary, we talked about. Bethlehem, you can see that Bethlehem is just into the green belt. It just gets the rain, and so does green. Nazareth, the mountains could tell you much more about that. Well, now tonight we've looked at places, got the feel of the country. Next time I'm going to take you through all that on the back wall. If you can have a look at it, that will be a help tonight. Right, now any questions you'd like to ask about all that? Books to read. First of all, books to look at. Do you know these two books? They are the finest collection of superb photographs on the Holy Land I know. Get them out of your library. Photo Guide to the Old and New Testament. A lot of information in them, but some of the photographs are just incredible. Whoever took them really knew what he was doing. Just try and find one that will just illustrate this.
David Alexander took them all. His mother lives just a few miles and he took 3,000.
Really? Well, he said it was worth taking 3,000 again. I am the true vine. And you can almost see a man standing like that, can you? Holding people up. You see that? What a perfect picture of Christ, you see? I am the true vine. Just holding up the branches and the leaves and bearing much fruit. It's laden with fruit. And it's just little touches like that. When you hear the cock crowing, that was one of the deepest moments for us, to be standing in the very spot where Jesus was on trial before Annas and Caiaphas. And a cock crew, and everybody said, listen, a cock crew. And we all sort of smiled and grinned, you know, how appropriate, that's something to write in the diary. And then the cock crowed twice. And the whole mood of the party changed. And we just went quiet, we thought. Have I betrayed, you know, have I denied? And it just, the twice was just a bit much for us, you know. Right, so I'll give you those three. Other books to read, if you want to do any books. There is a fascinating book on Masada out now, if you're interested in that. It's not in the Bible, but it's a fascinating piece of Jewish history. It's just called Masada, and that's a book to get out of the library. It's over £3. If you're as interested in the geography of the land as I am, if I've managed to convey interest to you, the best book on the geography to read, purely on the geography, the rainfall, the rocks, but all as it bears on the Bible, a book by Dennis Bailey called The Geography of the Bible. Now, if any of you teach geography, that's a perfect book for it. It's very readable, but it's called The Geography of the Bible. Now, if you want a little tourist book that just takes you round, there is a book called Come and See by Ronald Brownrigg, a Methodist minister, which is quite good. There's another little one, I wonder if it's still in print, Brian, by Stephen Winwood and Godfrey Robinson. I think that's probably gone out of print, unfortunately. The best book, of course, have you seen the El Al Airlines advertisements? The best book on Israel has been published for 2,000 years, and it just has a picture of the Bible, which is super. I will give you later, if I can, a list of Bible references and places. Have you got a copy of that, Ruth? I haven't been able to find it. Right, I'll keep on looking. I'll try and give you a list so that of the main references in the Bible to every place we visit, so that you can do a bit of reading before you go. You're not going to have a holiday I'm warning you, I'm going to work you very, very hard. I'll do it on this principle. I'm assuming that you'll not get a chance to go again, and in fact this may be our last trip out there. The prices are so rocking, I think it may well be our last trip. So you're very fortunate. We have 90 people after 45 places. But nevertheless, we really work you hard because it's 10 days and we pack everything in we can. Now some of you will get a bit faint by the 7th day. And what we suggest is this. When you're beginning to feel like that, take a half day off. We'll keep going, but you're far better taking a half day off than getting knocked up for the rest of the time. I rely on you to be sensible here. I know you don't want to miss anything, but the others can tell you about it and share it with you when they get back. If you're feeling at all faint, take a half day off. You know, if you're feeling you're just getting too much. But we really pack it in. If you can stay the course, and most people usually can, you will come back up to here not knowing where you've been. But in the succeeding months, as you think about it, as you read your Bible, it'll all slot into place, and a name will bring back a picture to your mind. Keep a full diary if you can, in note form. You won't have time for prose. Keep a notebook, keep it in your pocket, take it with you, just jot things down. Because when we go around with the bus, I'll just be saying things all the time, you know, about look over there and this is where this happened and so on. And the thing is to write it down. Peggy Burton took a tape recorder everywhere. She's got an entire series of cassettes of all the trips and all the things that were said in the buses. Not always publishable. What was one of the funniest? Anyway, if you're going to do that, we must edit it afterwards before we play it back. And take your camera, of course. Don't put films in the camera when you go through customs. They x-ray everything and that just finishes your films off, I'm afraid. So take your films out and put them in your pocket. Is that what happened to one film of yours, do you think?
It used to, doesn't it?
Pardon?
The technique used to do it, I understand, but it doesn't anymore.
The British Airways things states that they don't do it.
Oh, well, that's okay.
I just come back to Stockholm and I haven't lost that.
Yes. Just bear in mind, are we going El Al or another airline?
There is the choice.
Because El Al is the safest one in the world now, actually, because their security is fantastic. It has to be. So that if you want to be really safe, you go on an Israeli plane, even though so many used to be hijacked or attacked. They really are very tight on security. I'll say much more next time about the modern situation, the Arab-Israeli conflict. We'll meet at least once more and tell you more practical things then as to what clothes to take and where we meet and all the rest of it. But tonight I wanted to give you the feel of the land. We could have had a slideshow, but I don't think that's the best way. I wanted you to get the shape of it.